Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Lachlan Phillips. He is the founder of LiveMind AI, and we're going to have a great conversation about decentralized AI and what that means and why it's important. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So what is decentralized AI?
Uh, so to me, decentralized AI is basically um, looking at the way, human intelligence and culture and our technology has evolved and try and extend that on sort of to its natural progression. So, uh, one way that people approach AI at the moment is they have this sort of black box approach where it's like you use their system knows everything, their system kind of, pings you back an answer. Decentralized AI would be structured more along the lines of how a brain is structured, or more along the lines of how the World Wide Web is structured. So much more collaborative.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's something I've been thinking about is like human consciousness itself is pretty decentralized. Like not only in the sense of like the brain, because the brain doesn't have one center where it works, and there's all these things that it shows that when you lose 90% of your brain, it can still function in various ways. Like it's pretty rare for that to happen, but that's only at the brain level. The brain is decentralized, but so is our groups of people, or they were very, very decentralized for most of the periods of history. And then something happened, and we became really, really centralized. And then the the radio and the TV both continued to help that centralization process. But then the internet, it's kind of decentralized it, but also was sort of centralized because it had this client server relationship where the way that you use the internet is you use a bunch of servers that are on somebody else's like location. And so now it kind of got centralized again. And now the AI is basically ending up in that same situation, kind of, because there's a few companies that are kind of taking over all the compute and taking over all the AI, and creating these, very, very helpful AIs. But it also can lead to a lot of problems if we kind of analyze what's happened with this client server model in the last 10 years. What's your take on that? Is that accurate?
I think that's relatively accurate with the caveat that centralization, at least to me, is it's a function of decentralization.
Hmm.
If you create if you have a totally anarchistic sort of system,
Hmm.
uh, and it's totally voluntary and everybody can freely associate within that system, centralization will be an emergent property of that
Uh,
by voluntary collaboration. So it's less about the fact that things are centralized to me. It's more about the fact that uh, that those systems um, get embedded, and they get embedded often at odds with people's natural sort of inclinations. So a free forming, imagine a river. You'll have little eddies and stuff like that. Anytime those eddies are,
uh,
forced, if you put a machine in to like continue and maintain those eddies, then the river can no longer kind of flow freely and naturally. So it's not the centralization itself that's the problem. Um, it's the separation of those sort of information flows from those central structures, and that leads to kind of like consolidation of power, and it leads to all of these negative things, because under those circumstances the centralized unit becomes decoupled from the participants. Does that make sense?
it doesn't. I mean, I got a lot of it, but there's the central point I'm missing, and so basically, I like it though, where they're like it's not a strong difference between centralization and decentralization. They seem to be on some sort of spectrum, and like one is more dominant at one point and the other one is more dominant at another point. Um, let's see if I can isolate what I didn't understand. It's basically like the pockets of the river are decentralized, but the whole river is centralized. Is that what you're saying?
The river's maybe not a super great metaphor there, but essentially any group of individuals sort of use humans as an example, right? People can operate in a completely anarchistic way, and that can be great under certain circumstances. And under certain circumstances, people will want to get together and they'll say, "Hey, you guys do what you want, but us 10, we're gonna agree to these protocols or these practices."
Got
And
it.
they're entering that voluntarily, and they can leave it voluntarily. And to me, that's a perfectly fine kind of like version of some form of
Got
centralization.
it. Got it. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. And that's the freedom by association, freedom of association is really interesting in this new time. Uh, What do you think happened over the past few years in terms of this theme that we're talking about, and how, like, for me, maybe I'll set it up a little bit more. For me, I'm very, very nervous about large companies owning this technology because it's such a powerful technology. And if we look at what happened in with Facebook and Google, or Google started to censor their results about a lot of different stuff, and so like like Google censoring results is different than like one TV station censoring results. Like one large TV station in the United States censoring the results is far, far different than Google censoring their results in the entire world for the thing that no one else really uses, Bing. At that time, no one was using Bing. So, like, what do you think happened over the past few years, and why is it so important that we decentralize AI?
Uh, yeah, well, I think at the end of the day, Google entered the market. Essentially, they've said we're agnostic data brokers, or we're an agnostic kind of data repository. So you can use us. We will, so communication wise, the communication network was decentralized. You can talk to anyone, you can share any information, you can access any information. But infrastructure wise, it was very centralized. Everything
Yeah.
would funnel through Google servers. And they've made a very common mistake that I see over and over again, where people they get put into a position of power by virtue of them adhering to fundamentally, human areas, and then they say we have a platform, we have to use our platform for this function or that function, and I don't tend to believe that. I don't think that people are giving Google a platform. I think people are using Google because of those principles, and as soon as Google abandons those principles, people will just move. They don't have a monopoly, um, and the whole idea of using a platform to impart your wisdom upon the poor masses. I just don't buy it.
And in a world where there's a bunch of different opportunities, then a lot of people will just make the switch as long as there's a bunch of opportunities. And it doesn't seem like we're going to have a global government anytime soon. And a global government's the only one who could kind of force us in order to choose various options. An example of that being like in Stalinist Russia, where it's like the government kind of did make most of the decisions, most of the important decisions. You kind of had to deal with it. But we're in a world. Are you following distributed computing at all? Are you in that at all? If so, what have you learned there?
I haven't particularly been following it. I've got my own sort of train of thought on that, and uh, my particular angle into that and area of interest is probably more in distributed storage.
Cool.
I'm a little bit of a I'm a little bit of an outsider in that world, so I haven't really been sort of, I like the DAO kind of concept as a concept, but I'm sort of not really in the crypto space or anything like that. I've had some really interesting conversations with a gentleman called Mark Nadal, who created a database system called GunDB, so completely decentralized. Have had some early interactions with the guy who created IPFS, so interplanetary file system. So
Uh-huh.
there's a handful of people who are really trying to solve this, essentially this problem of does centralized infrastructure incentivize centralized control, and if it does, how do we sidestep that? And it's like the old saying, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Some people might not think that turning your so-called platform into a social engineering megaphone is a form of corruption. I think it is because you're fundamentally kind of like putting yourself above other people and your opinion above other people's opinions by virtue of your arbitrary power that you have. So
It's so strange the problems we get into with humans. I love IPS, IFPS, GunDB. I want to go research more about GunDB. I have heard about IFPS. Well, what is the relationship with decentralized AI? And I'd love to talk more about LiveMind.ai as well. But what is the relationship between distributed storage and AI? And I know you mentioned you don't have a huge inflow there, but uh, like how do we decentralize the AI?
uh, well, I think there's the ways that stability are going
Hmm.
about it. They're just distributing these big models, and that's great. I mean, they've got these pieces of software, and they say, "Hey, here's a piece of software, run it on your machine, knock yourself out." Right?
Yeah.
They still ultimately, and that's great. That's absolutely wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that. But they're still required to do the training centrally.
Uh-huh.
And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
philosophically speaking, uh, philosophically speaking, I don't draw a distinction between the
Yeah.
neurons in a neural network and the individuals in a community and the neurons in people's brains. I just think there's one network that we're dealing with, and so there's one global network, and some aspects of that global network are adhering to those voluntary, node association type of principles, and some aspects of that network are not. And so that's my personal view is that you've got something there that like take large language models, right? You've gotten ahead of the game a little bit because you've used a centralized infrastructure.
Yeah.
But there's no reason that I can see that you should need a centralized infrastructure to manifest that. And to me, just purely as an artist, uh, uh, it feels off key of what that should be. Sort of, the beauty of it should be that it's a decentralized sort of collaborative space that these thoughts and token predictions emerge from.
I love it. So that I've thought a lot about decentralized AI and how to from this angle of distributed computing, because my idea is that we need a way to compute, and storage is a very important part of that. We need to compute outside of the client server architecture, it seems like, because I thought something about the client server architecture was extremely open to the kind of capture that we talked about with Google, and but also goes all the way back to kings and stuff like that as well. It's just like the same thing that we keep on getting over and over and over again. And then what you mentioned about decentralized AI was really interesting. It's like because it's the training. It's also the AI training that could be decentralized. What does AI training look like that is decentralized? And I'll set this up a little bit more because I used to work at an AI training company, and that was really interesting because we were kind of helping with RLHF. We were doing supervised fine tuning, and with a lot of human labor, and what would it look like to decentralize the training for that? Are you aware of any projects that are doing that?
Uh, I am aware of, I can't think of offhand, but there are efforts to decentralize compute.
Hmm.
And again, that's sort of outside of my
Your
area
realm.
of expertise. I think my basic kind of like it's very idealistic. Um, Ideally, everything or as much as possible gets pushed to the client, to individual clients.
Hmm.
Because I think one of the main features of neural networks that I think are really important are that regardless of how involved someone is in the software and the architecture and all of those sorts of things, they're still fundamentally involved in the experience of sensing their environment, of feeling and expressing their own needs, and that back propagation needs to fundamentally kind of happen at the individual client level.
Oh, feeling your needs. Oh, interesting. Uh, that's a really interesting point, because so from what I learned about training, that basically what they're doing with training with RLHF is that there's a human being who pretends to be both the user and the bot. And so they go through conversations or turns, and they create inside of their head a story of a user asking a question to a bot, and then the bot responding, and then going back to the user, and then back to the bot, and do 4 to 8 of those, and essentially have a conversation. And then that teaches the AI how to respond in an appropriate manner according to various things. I love what you said about, I believe that's what you said, is that a human being, there's all this stuff going inside the human brain's mind as well that could be kind of used as training data. Um, uh, that right now it seems like it's not even possible to do that. Well, actually, with Neuralink now, it does seem like it's actually going to be. Ooh, that's an interesting idea. Um, because I just saw the demo of Neuralink a few days ago, and for my listeners who don't know, Neuralink is a chip that's being placed inside the head of somebody who had a C4 C5 vertebrae fraction and is paralyzed from the neck down. And now with Neuralink, he can control the computer with his mind. And then once I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, it's here already. But then I looked and I found that DARPA actually has already been working on this project, and it's actually farther ahead than Neuralink, and it's already doing a lot more. And there's a lot of other people doing a lot of other things in this realm. And what do you think about that? That feels like we definitely need to decentralize that particular technology, because all the things that we've been talking about, like so having a chip inside of my head, I'm not expecting to get it. I'm very skeptical of this technology. I'm not skeptical of the power of the technology. I'm skeptical of the power of the people who are owning the technology having something inside my mind. But I guess there's no fundamental difference between that. Well, there's a fundamental difference, but it's not a large difference between having a chip in my mind and going on Facebook every day and then just getting,
Mhm.
inundated with information from whatever the algorithm decides it should be in my mind. What's your take on all that?
Uh, well, I think I'm probably a network maximalist,
Mm,
so I tend to think of an awful lot of things in terms of network structures
mm,
and network density and
mm,
how information is back propagated through networks and stuff. So
mm,
so even when it comes down to something like uh, I have a real issue with people talking about alignment, for example. Alignment to me is it's an attempt to put uh, a new frame on just an ageless problem, right? It's like, you've got a whole bunch of people with they have a collection of individual needs, individual wants, and then they possibly under certain circumstances they have a collection of sort of shared needs, and we've tried to encapsulate a very small subset of everyone's needs under Universal Declaration of Human Rights and stuff like that. We said,
uh-huh,
okay, those are, and even that is
uh-huh.
not totally like spot on across the board. So you have this sort of this problem of how do you align the system, um, when really, uh, you know realistically what you actually end up with is some kind of market almost. It's like you've got this a whole bunch of agents out there in the world experiencing things. Those things are back propagating up through the network, and they're pooling in little consensus graphs. And maybe at some point in that network is a large sort of embodiment of some collective consensus, um,
Mm, mm.
that
Interesting.
represents people on the whole. And I think that the top down approach is not working in that respect, because
Yes.
you'll have a company run by an individual who says, I know what's moral, I'm going to put it in there. And then you say, look, you don't know what's moral, you can't possibly, by the very nature of it. And so they go, all right, well, we're gonna put a small subset of people to RLHF this, and that'll represent you. And you go, none of this, you know what I mean? Like, none of this represents anything that I know about democracy or individual expression or anything. It just is completely the wrong paradigm to be looking at these networks.
I love that. Network maximalist. It's just so funny and so absurd. Because I definitely think that it's the right way to run a company. It's right. It feels like the right way to have run a company is have one person in charge of the company, and then have a board that kind of oversees but it's like one of those dictatorships where it's like this still that one person makes most of the decisions unless they do something very egregious. Uh, and then you have, layers going down. I feel like that makes the most sense to run a company, but then maybe up until 150 people. And then once you get to 150 people, then where the same problem happens that we've been discussing happens within the company itself, which is that once you get to that large of a grouping of human beings, then things start to break, and we can see this with the bureaucracies that have started to, at least in my country, it feels like maybe in other countries as well, that the bureaucracy itself is just this giant machine that's just like sucking up power, and not even according to idealistic goals or anything like that. It feels like they're just like in control by sociopaths, and those sociopaths just want to have more power. And so they're just doing the political incentives in order to gain the budget for a larger bureaucracy, and just eating up different things. For example, the CDC in the United States had their budget double in the past few years because of some institutional dynamics that led to a lot of power for them to have a lot of power. And so, but going back to the company, it's like that, it feels like that makes sense. If you disagree, I'd love to talk with you. But then the fact that the company of, what is Google? Google's like 100,000 people run by one person who has a board, and then different levels of management who also have some decision making and such. But the problem space that they're controlling is the world's information, and like they can't they don't have the bandwidth. They're busy running a company. They don't have the bandwidth to understand the philosophical implications of what it means to be evil. And so they explicitly, at some point in a board meeting, had to get together and say, "Well, guys, let's get rid of that one. We gotta become evil now." Like that actually happened in a boardroom. And so yeah, where it's really weird where we're entering, but I'm really optimistic about the future, at least on the medium term. Um, uh, oh, network maximalist is a really interesting thing. I've never heard about that. It reminds me of the interview I did with Stephen Wolfram only a few days ago, where he was explaining his new form of physics that he's been thinking about. And I asked him, we were talking about space. I can't remember what we were talking about in terms of like space, like space in the room, space in outer space. And I said, well, what happens if you place something? Does it remove the space that the object you placed in it takes up? And he's like, no, there is no empty space. The entire universe is a network of particles, and even if it's empty, even if it has no objects in it that we can see, at the fundamental physics level, it's there. And so I like this idea of a network maximalist, because that the network, the internet, and all these networks are just abstractions of something real, but real in the sense like money's real. It's like it's real in the sense that we have a shared understanding of the world. And so you can respond to anything I said there, or we can go further into the network maximalist and kind of like go into what that means to be a network maximalist.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it was Wolfram you were talking to. I mean, I think that's a pretty um, there's a lot of across the board. There's a lot of sentiment in science and philosophy and all sorts of areas that um, the idea of having an object as a separate thing
Yeah.
is a it's a fairly if you really think about it, it's a fairly abstract concept, right? Humans
Uh,
have decided that because we love tools, and it's much easier for us to sort of conceptualize a spear rather than what we're actually, the the
yeah,
wave function that we're actually
interesting.
interacting with.
Yeah.
So I do tend to approach things from that angle. I do tend to think that's a good, you can go too far with it. You do have to sort of manipulate concepts to get anywhere in life. Um, but sometimes if you hit if you hit a point with your thinking where you're butting up against a wall, sometimes it does sort of pay to step back from that. And certainly with respect to trying to, I think there's a couple of camps with AI in particular. There's a couple of camps there. There are people out there who are going, we're making an android, or we're making a thinking person or a thinking thing or something like that. And then there's sort of there's a camp out there that essentially sees it as a continuation of a process that's sort of been underway for a long period of time,
Mm.
um, and a representation of something that has always existed. So that the collective unconscious.
Mm.
You touched on it there briefly, that we do have shared concepts. Um, you could argue that everybody should, there's a whole qualia argument. It's like, do you see red the same way I see red? All this sort of stuff. I think
Oh, interesting.
by and large, there's a hell of a lot that's shared. Um, and do you map that? Do you map that? Do you in dictionaries map it, encyclopedias map it, science maps it, and then at that point, those things become they become real, they become
Yeah.
tangible, and you can relate them as concepts. So to me, that's a far more fundamental and far more sort of human centric approach. It's to say, the human experience is at the core of it, and then what we do at this point is we try and create some malleable representation of those concepts and those ideas so that we can experience them in a much more tangible sense.
Ooh, interesting. And that almost feels like what we're headed for in terms of technology. I love this idea. I play around with it a lot myself, is that we're communicating with words. We're sharing images through these words. We're getting the vibe of what we're saying, and then we're transmitting it to people as well who are crazy enough to be listening. And so that space, although not tangible with our fingers, may actually become extremely tangible in our fingers, because it can become tangible to our fingers if one of us decides to say, "Oh, hey, there's a really interesting idea in there. Let me go create that in the physical world." Either in an art form, or in a business, or a technology, or an invention. And so, and then all the tools for doing that are going to get much, much better with AI. I guess this is a great time to talk about what LiveMind is. What is LiveMind?
So LiveMind is essentially, it's a business to business software as a service business. And most of what we're doing at the moment is intelligent knowledge bases. So you have a persona you can talk to. That persona knows your business or your industry's domain, and sort of speaks to that. That's a big part that's a big need in business and academia, to speak to auditable knowledge. It's one thing to have a large language model that knows everything, and you kind of trust that it knows everything. You just hope and pray that it's right. But a lot of what businesses need is they need to know that it's speaking to internal documents, it's speaking to internal goals. You get a response from your persona, or an action from your agent, and it's acting upon, you can see why it's doing it. You see the documents it's referencing. Um, it's almost um, you're almost sidestepping the language model's knowledge.
Mm.
And more often than not, if the language model comes out with an answer, even if it's a better answer, if it's not an answer that's auditable, it's basically useless within that domain.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Very,
So
very
that's what
cool.
we're doing a lot of. Yeah. Under the hood, though, LiveMind is it's a graph network. It's a node network.
Cool.
So each node is in this particular market, each node represents a UI element. So a node might be an input, a node might be a processing node, or an API node. And so you can basically build any kind of AI application using this sort of node framework.
That's really interesting. So I actually did a lot of this. I was the director of knowledge management at the AI training that I was the company that we were previously talking about. And so knowledge bases was the basic domain. And I was trying to figure out a lot of this stuff. And it's actually a business problem I'm having right now, which is that I'm helping to facilitate a business club. And so we're going to have conversations with entrepreneurs. And then before we meet with all together, we're going to have four entrepreneurs meet together and I'm going to facilitate a conversation. But before we do that, we're going to have conversations with each of them individually, asking them some certain questions. And based on that initial interview process, then we're going to do a facilitated conversation. And so the person I'm working with, they're not very AI savvy. So I was like, oh man, this conversation stuff, we can use AI to do this. But then the one problem I keep on running into is related to what we've been talking about, which is that I don't trust OpenAI. I think I don't think that they're nefarious. I don't think that they're out to get anybody or anything like that. But I do question whether they will become that way in the same way that Google became that way. And so I'm like, how do I do this in a way? What's your approach to security? Is that like, and really what I'm looking for is like either it's not necessarily Firefly because or Otter, but I might have to end up using those. But it's also me not wanting to input the data into GPT that'll be on their servers. Do you guys have a security mechanism for that?
So yeah, we primarily use OpenAI, and I've just gotten Anthropic running. But again, I think that this particular space, we've been looking at this recently, that you don't need the most advanced language model in the world
Mm.
to reinterpret client data, which means you can basically push it all offline onto
Local.
Mistral or any of these other
Oh,
sort of open source models,
oh, great.
and for clients as well. I mean, they're looking at internal.
Yeah, great.
It's like you enter the market. Um, all of your buddies are doing SaaS. You use SaaS all day long. Everything is on the cloud, and then you enter a corporation sort of environment, and you inherit all of these really weird practices of
Yeah.
like, hey, I need to talk to that computer just over there. Should we also send it over to Silicon Valley, just see if they want to have a look at the data as well? It's like, well, why? You don't need to do that anymore. You're
Yeah.
inside of a intranet. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's coming back. It's all, we've been talking about this centralization thing too. It's just like it all like comes back in a circle, basically. Everything just comes back in a circle. Eventually, you're gonna have to deal with the same problem in a new way. Like money, for example, the crypto. I know you mentioned DAO as well. So it's like the crypto solved some interesting problems, but then the same problem showed up, which is that if I pay somebody in Bitcoin, I have no way of getting that money back. Whereas a credit card, if
oh
you
yeah.
use a credit card, you have a way of getting that money back. But I would much rather give up that safety of having that and use Bitcoin rather than other means of transactions and such.
Yeah, well, we
Um,
struggled with it. The business I was running during the pandemic, Orbits, was doing virtual events and virtual offices, and we had all sorts of ambitions about everyone is going to have their own venue on a map.
hmm,
They're going to control that, decentralized and all this sort of stuff. Um, and you realize just in the pace of deploying features and stuff like that, people the market is not thinking in a hugely sophisticated way about it, but they are thinking, I will pay you to deal with it, you know?
yeah,
So
yeah,
so they are willing to hand you, they're saying, we will hand you our data, you deal it, we pay you, we trust you. And so there is a lot of utility to centralization. Then as a vendor, it just becomes a question of um, not morality, but principles as
mm,
to whether you go the extra mile. Nobody's paying you to do it. So unless you have some sort of financial incentive to do it, I'm not too sure exactly why. And I've been banging on about this on Twitter recently, just saying, please, please, someone give me a financial model to open source. I so desperately want to do it, but I have not yet found a really great model for that.
Interesting. And that's
Um,
cool because we got all these models that are very proprietary for finance companies that they make a whole bunch of money. And if we open source it, what does that give us if we open source a financial model?
yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of good cases, but I haven't found one. I think that there is uh, well, certainly in some cases the stakes are low. But if you want to be a purist about it and you want to say, look, let's just kind of completely for the fun of it, build a completely decentralized system. I think you have to fundamentally solve that incentive
Yes,
problem.
yeah, got it. Yes, yeah,
You have to
yeah, yeah,
say,
yeah.
you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah, because it's you need to incentivize people, and this is I learned a lot about this at my previous company. The founder of the company, Francis Pedraza, is like an expert, a master class at he is a master at designing incentive structures, and what you're talking about, like the trust involved when you use a service, you're paying somebody, and you trust them enough that you think that they have your best interest in mind, and then they may have your best interest in mind, but in 80% of the cases, but then there's like 20% of the cases that are they may have other things in mind, and they may not actually be able to see those things in their mind, and they could be incentivized not to do things, um I love this question of trust, and actually that's what we've been talking about this entire time, I think, as well. And it's like I interviewed somebody who's building an agent company a few days ago, on the decision frameworks and for AIs and how to make them sort of autonomous and go out and do things for you. And came up with an interesting question, which is like, do I trust the machine with my credit card more than I trust a human being? And in the previous era of client server, we've been, trusting both the machine and the human. But then what we're talking about, because we trust the human and the machine because it's in a centralized company. And so at the top, there's a human being. And then what we're talking about is sort of decentralizing the AI so that no human being is in that loop. And it's like there's a question of trust there, of do I trust the human being or the robot more than the human being? Oftentimes, yes, but I haven't spent enough time with this conversation to really understand that. And going back to that alignment piece, because a lot of the alignment conversation is happening around basically being like, this technology is going to be too powerful. We need to align it to human values rather than have it come up with values on its own. And then become another intelligent actor that we have to model and figure out. And I don't believe what the existential fear people are selling, but there's something interesting there about trusting the machine. Do you trust the machine? How do you think about this?
um, do I trust the machine? Well, I think a lot of this stuff kind of um, it all basically any sort of agent in the world is the stakes are very human. You know,
Yes. Yep.
the benefits are very human. The stakes are human pain, human suffering. So you know, it essentially, um, and I think probably will automatically kind of like veer back towards human in the loop, human taking responsibility. You know, there's no agent, there's no machine out there. There's a human with a machine. There's a human with a tool.
Yeah.
And those responsibilities are being taken by those individuals acting with those tools and setting those things into motion. That doesn't mean it's solved. That's very, you know, you've got a whole bunch of layers of complexity on that in terms of you know, tragedy of the commons and how many people are putting certain things into motion. But essentially, I think that's not a bad angle in, as to say you have a human. Ultimately, these actions are have consequence when they create human suffering, or you know, they have benefits when they create human
Yeah.
flourishing.
Interesting. That's going to bring the legal structures into strong focus. And it seems that the global decentralized way of governance is not currently fit to understand the incentives that are going to come up when we have decentralized AI, which is a very powerful technology in the hands of a lot of people. And that tragic tragedy of commons thing is very like, it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out and how we legislate that, because there needs to be some sort of responsibility mechanism or accountability mechanism to be like, well, if a bad actor uses this, first, how do we find them? And then second, like, what is the appropriate a way that we need to make sure that that doesn't happen again? And if that's even possible. And it just like that's I'm definitely an optimist, a techno optimist, as I believe you are as well. But um, uh, that doesn't seem like a problem that we're going to figure out very soon. And that might be like a problem that we figure out on the 1,000-year time scale, maybe 500 years, something like that. But what's your take on that?
Uh, well, I think there's a lot of conversation. It's like we're going to act in the ecosystem in this way, and then we're going to respond to it in this other way.
Uh,
We put a system out there, and then how is democracy going to respond to the system? I tend to think of democracy as a good example because it's kind of a multi-layered neural network. It's kind of
interesting.
a consensus a consensus extraction network. So realistically, in my view, the way you solve it isn't to say, how do we get our democracy to respond to the network? We set our network up such that it incentivizes better
Got it.
consensus extraction mechanisms.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So essentially, we need a sort of moment like the founding moment of the United States, where you just have a whole bunch of people who really, really have studied incentives throughout history, and then get together and I guess that's what Anthropic kind of tried to do with they said they have a constitution for the AI, but again, it's the same problem that we've been talking about, which is that yeah, that's great, all great. Then 10 and 20 years down the line, what happens? Like when you get past this point of survival inside of your business, you become a large business with $100 billion in revenue or whatever, like, well, then what happens? And when you get a knock on the door from the NSA or the CIA and be like, and then, nobody knows about that knock on the door. And maybe those things have already happened, but, uh, the, so, and I guess it could come in sort of the DAO thing. How, and it could also kind of involve the thoughts about network states and sovereign individuals and people being able to move geographically if their political institutions are no longer doing what they should be doing, they can pick up and move to another one that does actually do it better. Um, uh, how do we actually come up with a way? And it doesn't feel like we can do it in a centralized way, but that like the founders of the United States did it in a sort of centralized way, which is that they had like I don't know how many there are, but like they had 100 or so, and they got together and they came up with the Constitution. They had just won the Revolutionary War, or they just started the Revolutionary War, and then they won the war, and then they were like, okay, well, now we do this. And there's a lot of argument, there's a lot of debate, and everything like that. What does that look like for our next voyage into this weird technology world?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting problem because um, your first instinct is always to say, I know what's right. I know exactly what's going to be the correct sort of moral framework, and let's just let's lay it down. Let's put it into principles. Let's save everyone a bunch of time. But what's interesting to me, or an interesting question to me, is probably to say, if you could get everyone on Earth to contribute to a document of what their priorities are,
Yeah,
and
interesting.
what remains, what stays in that document. You got a big wiki, absolutely everybody can put their needs and their principles in there. What of that remains, and that's an interesting exercise in and of itself. But even more interesting is to say, what is the infrastructure that provides for that? What is the infrastructure that allows people to access that? Check this out. Um, what is the infrastructure that provides for that? What is the infrastructure that allows people to access that information? What's the infrastructure that allows that to both remain stable over long enough periods for humanity to act in service of those principles? And 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, those may have changed slightly. They may have shifted, and our little 2024 perspective is probably not relevant. There might be some things that stay, but at the end of the day, you've got to keep that back propagation of really human, things in your system in order to create any kind of collective agency around those principles.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned a few things that I want to go further into that. There's this thought of like if you get people to explicitly say something, and I know that you'll know what I'm talking about in this with because you're doing knowledge bases. One of the interesting things that I learned in the previous job was that there's the explicit knowledge, but the explicit knowledge is just like the tip of the iceberg. Then there's the implicit knowledge. Then there's things that are really hard to formalize. Then there are things that people can't really formalize. And then there's, and then there's the part that I want to talk about, which is the unconscious. And if everybody writes down explicitly, there's this unconscious aspect that it's a lot of times people don't know what they want. And this is what I learned from Wolfram is that we did our first interview back in 2018, and he said that AI is coming. Let's if we think about it, the machine will be able to do what we want. So now we got to figure out what we want. And then now we did another interview a couple of days ago, and the AI is here and it can do a lot of the things we want. So now we got to figure out what we want. So but a lot of times people don't know what they want, and they have clashing, contradictory motives underneath inside the unconscious. And so I was thinking, how do we get AI? AI is actually probably pretty good at that. It's probably pretty good at reading people's humans and knowing what they may want. Actually, what do you think? Do you think that currently the AI is very good at understanding a human better than a human itself?
I think they've done a pretty good job. I mean, the early I'll criticize RLHF until the end of times, but in terms of that's in terms, but that's just that's a
Implementation.
criticism of it at the model level. At
Yeah.
the agent level or the persona level, I think it's great. It's a wonderful thing to add on. You chat with Claude or you chat with
Yeah.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, that's cool.
You'll get a reasonable amount of it's pretty good at sort of settling into a particular persona that's understanding and kind of like hits the points quite well. I mean, I do think every individual is going to find a unique sort of alignment of that serves
Mm.
them better. So I don't think it'll top down, but I think they do a pretty good job. I think Anthropic should be commended on that Claude persona. It's a fantastic persona.
Oh, interesting.
Although I don't agree with the fact that they have the only they're the only ones who can tuck in
Yeah.
and drive that.
Yep.
I just as a little aside there, I was asking Claude to review some documents, and um, I noticed it just put an extra paragraph in a document saying it's also important to put in policies that for safety. And I'm like, no, I didn't write I didn't write that. What are you talking about?
So funny the RLHF what it does. I think it's so absurd too because there's all these goals that we've been talking about of like, oh, we've got to make it nice. We've got to make it politically agreeable. We've got to do all these things to it to make sure that it's not being mean or whatever. And it just like it's so absurd the things that come out of it. I was going back and forth with Perplexity. For my listeners who don't know, Perplexity is another AI kind of thing, and what they do is they actually just get the models from other people and then use whichever model you want to use in order to go do a web search. Um, and then I was asking it about tobacco, and wanting to understand what is it, the mechanics of the receptors and acetylcholine, all those different things inside of nicotine, what it does to the human body. And it gave you just this long list of things like tobacco is the blah blah blah. It's really dangerous. You're gonna die. You're gonna do all this different stuff. And I was just like, please do that again. No, none, nothing. Don't tell me anything subjective about it. And that's all the RLHF is doing. It's putting a bunch of layers between the information that I actually want.
Yeah.
And these layers are all just absurd. They're all just like, okay, uh, and every time I ask it for any sort of political philosophy or anything like that, there's usually two flavors of the conversation, which is one is like, um, if anything relates to human beings, like indigenous, you got to talk about the indigenous people or something. And then the other one is uh, there's like Ethical. Yeah, you got to think about the ethical stuff. And the ethical stuff, it's like now anytime I hear somebody is an AI ethicist, I'm just like, oh man, this guy is loves the centralized stuff. And it's just like it's such an absurd thing. There's so many weird things that are happening right now because of people's
Yeah, I just
attempt to
hear it.
control. Yeah. What's
I
that?
hear it, and I just think I hear someone say they're an AI ethicist, and I think as a general principle of exploring these things and writing about them and stuff like that, that's great. But as an applied
Yeah.
job in the market, they're saying one thing. They're saying, I know better than you. And I just reject that. I don't believe it.
Yeah.
I don't think they're
Okay.
more moral than me, you know?
Yeah,
I just don't
exactly.
think they're more moral than anybody.
That's
I don't
really
think
it.
they've got the right to say that.
Yeah, I've got the better morals than you. That's it. Yeah. It's so ridiculous. Well, thank you
There's
so
a good
much.
little hack around that.
What's
Incidentally,
that?
there's a good prompt hack. There's a good prompt hack.
Go for it.
Um, so I found out that this is ChatGPT. I'm sure it'll work with Claude as well. ChatGPT just wants to say the thing that it's itching to say the thing. It's got to say the disclaimer. And if you give it a narrative reason to say the disclaimer outside of the so in this example, I was asking it, what's the most fun you can have in Vegas? Um, and it's giving me all of these, stay safe and all this sort of nonsense. And I said, give me the response from two different personas. Give me the response from somebody who lives in Vegas, and then any disclaimers, any caveats, any safety warnings that can come from Sam Altman. And so I put that I put that system prompt in, and suddenly this AI is giving me all of these really fun things to do in Vegas. And then Sam Altman will pipe in at the end and he'll say, but it's important to remember to be safe when you're out and about and traveling around. And you just filter that part of the response out, and suddenly you've got this really great persona.
Oh, oh, interesting. So this is something you're doing as a programming thing. You're taking the OpenAI API and then you're putting that system prompt on it. And then you're actually the only thing you're displaying is what you just talked about. And then you keep the Sam Altman off of the display.
Yeah, so if you're
Yeah.
trying to do this as a system prompt, you'll just say output it in JSON as two dialogues, the first and the second, and then you just take the first entry of the JSON and use that as your output. It's a nice little trick because it just gets it out of its system basically, and you can just filter it out.
Out of system. And that's the whole thing. It's all when you're having a conversation with this bot with the RLHF, there's still so many ways to jailbreak it, and they're all relatively easy.
Mm.
And the thing itself has a lot of cybersecurity issues because like it's very easy to break the jailbreak or jailbreak
Mhm.
the prompts so that it does actually give you the information you want, including bad actors, cyber actors. Like they can use ChatGPT, I believe, to do a lot of things. Although they're getting better at making sure that doesn't happen. But there's still a lot of a lot of exploits. But I think the funniest part is just like what you just described. It's like what was hacking 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you had to figure out, how the system worked and find a loophole there. And here the loophole is inside of our language. So it's like the social engineering, basically, you're social engineering the bot in ways to make it produce what you want to produce.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it, and especially interesting to sort of note that um, they make a very safe consumer product. And again, I think Anthropic has nailed it in that respect. They've hit it. They've got a product that is super marketable. It's super safe in that market. But other than being a great product in the market, I don't think it stops bad actors from accessing anything. I don't tend to think there's any huge danger to people accessing information. You can access all the
Yeah.
same information online, but these RLHF systems don't really do an awful lot to stop bad actors.
Just stop the lazy
You know,
ones. They just
they
stop
just
the
have
lazy
things to
ones.
do, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people
Oh,
find out more
pleasure.
about what you're working on?
You can follow me on Twitter. I'm BitCloud at BITCLOUD. Or you can visit livemind.ai, sign up. Um, and you can DM me any issues you've got. There's a bunch of apps on LiveMind. Personas, you can access Claude, you can access OpenAI, and there's a couple of other weird ones. We're just in an implementation of WorldSim, which is one of the really fun jailbreaks of Claude. which lets you interface with Claude like a old school terminal, and you can
Oh,
access the the
cool.
back rooms and yeah, view all of these documents that it imagines it has in its system. So that's a lot of fun. But yeah, follow me on Twitter and DM me if you want.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Stuart.